Hi, I'm Angela Fehr. This is the third in a series of 5 videos showing some basic techniques in watercolor, painting a wild rose and pansies. If you missed the first 2 videos, take a look down in the description below or use the card above to skip to the first video. In this video, we're going to be taking the wet and wet technique and applying it on a smaller scale. And this is a wonderful way to keep control while still having that lovely loose effect in watercolor. I just showed you a wet and wet technique that was painted on a full and complete painting, and we're letting it dry as we work on this section of the painting. Wet and wet techniques don't have to be just for a big foundational layer, though. We can use them in a more controlled way to create some really beautiful effects. So I'm going to do that with my rose here. We're going to create some wet in wet petals. And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to start out by just wetting one of my flower petals. And my wild rose is a beautiful pale pink, and as it grows close to the center, it fades away to white so that the yellow center has a nice glow to it. So I've moistened this entire petal with water, and then from there I'm going to grab some quinacridone magenta, and I'm just going to touch it right there. And I love showing people that, because doesn't that look so beautiful, the way it just flows outward from where I placed it. This quinacridone magenta has a great dispersion. It really has a flow on that white or on that moisture. Some colors will move like that on wet paper. Some will stay more where you put them. And as you get to know your colors, you'll have a lot of fun learning their different properties and which ones to use when. So as that color moves, I can put the pink down fairly dark, and because it's flowing and moving across the paper, it's going to lighten as it moves and as that color spreads out. And I'm going to let that do its thing. I'm going to do another petal over on this side. So another wet and wet petal, just moistening that petal, and then again with the quinacridone magenta, and touching it in, letting it whoosh across the paper. And I could maybe touch it in over here too. Very light touch, just dabbing it in and letting it flow. And then we'll do another one. I think I'll go to this side. If I wet the whole flower, then I'd have a little less control. As this petal touched that petal, you could see some of the color just wanted to follow. I'm creating pathways. Every time I moisten my paper, I'm creating pathways for the pigment to follow. So I had this color that was moving around over here, swished over to that side, which I actually kind of like that effect. I'm going to dot in a little more magenta along the edge of the petal and let it move. And in just a moment, I'll show you a few tricks for controlling a wet wash, because there are a few things we can do. We aren't completely giving up control. I think skill and mastery in wet and wet comes from getting to really know it, giving those colors a chance to have their head, and then seeing what they're going to do, learning to anticipate what's going to happen, and learning how much you can or can control it. So I'm going to leave this petal for a second just because I want to show you some tips for controlling your washes. One thing you can do is, we know things move a lot when they're very moist. So by removing moisture, we can slow that movement. And we can actually use our brush as kind of like a sponge to lift out that water. I've rinsed my brush, it's nice and clean. I've blotted it on my paper towel so it's thirsty now. It's like a sponge. And so if I touch it into my painting here, I don't like those little tendrils that were happening of the pink kind of flowing, so I can use my thirsty brush to slurp up some of that moisture and lift up a little bit of color in the process. Over on this side, I've got kind of a bead of liquid that's created here. When you have a large area that's kind of got a little bit of a puddle on it, a bead of water, I often like to lift that color as well. Sometimes that bead of moisture will push back into a drying wash and create an edge that's not so pretty. So again, thirsty brush to just kind of lift it. And I prefer using a brush to a paper towel because you have control. You can shape the tip of your brush into a point, and then you can lift color just where you want it. So I can use that thirsty brush just to lift up some color. It gives me some beautiful variation in my wash. Now we're going to move on over to our final petal and repeat. Moistening the petal, touching in our magenta. I never get tired of seeing that color just travel across the moist paper. Gorgeous. And I've only used one color for this, so we're getting the beauty in it is the variation from light to dark in that pink. We could talk about adding some blue to create shadows. We could talk about maybe dotting in a little bit of yellow to in our center to flow out, and I'm actually going to do that just for fun. And it needs to happen while the painting is still moist, because if it's too dry, then that color is not going to want to move. So I might have waited a little bit longer than I should have. I'm going to just use my brush to kind of pull a little bit of that color really lightly into the pink. There, and that gives it a pretty yellow glow. Very nice. Now I'm going to use the same technique for my leaves. Grab some green. Actually, I'm going to use my green gold. It'll be in keeping with the freshness of the painting. And actually, I'm going to do, a wet and wet technique. This is what you may or may not want to do. And I say may or may not because it can create some beautiful effects. When I touched my green gold to my moist petal, the color again wants to move. It doesn't care that it's green and the petal's supposed to be pink. The painting does not care. So either plan to keep things very separate or allow for some of that to happen. And because I didn't moisten this leaf first, you can see this little brush stroke isn't moving at all. I can do a wet and wet technique by painting that with the pale green and then adding some of a different color to create my variation. I added some phthalo turquoise to give my leaf some vibrancy. And it's a wet and wet technique, but I started with colored water, with paint and water instead of just clear water. Now over here, I know you're panicking because everything's turning green on this petal. There's a couple things you can do. Again, the thirsty brush could lift out that color, and then I could add some more pink. The other thing that I know is that pink, remember how it had that beautiful flow and movement? It whooshed across the paper. That means if I go in with more pink right now, more of that magenta, it's going to do that whoosh thing again, and it'll go right across and overpower that green that came in. And so I'm actually kind of subduing the green without blotting. And often I find that's an easier way to go because you don't, you're not scrubbing color away. And often once we start blotting and lifting, it doesn't take long before we disturb the fibers of the paper, things start to look fussed over, and the texture gets kind of ugly. So I really believe in using a light touch, adding paint rather than blotting and scrubbing. Again, I'm going to use my brush as a guide to tell my color where to go. I'm going to pull some of that turquoise over along the edge of the leaf. And that looks really pretty. And now I'm going to paint some more leaves. Again, just doing the wet and wet, but starting with green this time. So I'm going to paint this leaf green, and it's quite juicy and moist. So I'm going to let that color soak in a little bit before I add the turquoise that I want to add. And the brush I'm using is quite large. This is a Princeton Neptune No. 4 quill. And it's got a very full body, and so I actually find I have to blot a lot of moisture out of it before I put it down on the paper. So I'm just about ready to move to a smaller brush for these small areas of my painting. The advantage of using a large brush is that you generally have less opportunity to fuss over your painting. And so your paintings look a little more relaxed when you're using a large brush. Okay, again, I'm getting some of that green gold bleeding into my pink petal. It doesn't bother me too much because what that can be sometimes is like a reflection of sunlight on your petal. It could be almost a transparency of these beautiful, delicate petals. But in this case, I am going to control it a little bit, just blotting with my brush to lift that color. Once it's dry, if I feel like it's still a little too greenish, I might go over it with a little bit more pink. If I add the pink now, it's going to want to flow out into my leaf, and I'm just not sure I want to do that this time. So even though we used Wet n Wet for our pansy background, and it felt very uncontrolled, and we couldn't do a lot to tell it where to go, you can see how we can use a Wet n Wet technique with a lot more control just by confining that wet area to one small area of your painting. When you have a small section of your painting that's moist, you get that beautiful fluidity while still maintaining control over the shape that you're working at over the section of your painting. And I'm going to use the point of my brush to create that little stem, flick a little color here and there. This is also giving the color opportunity for some of those little green areas to flow into each other, which I think is quite pretty. I actually kind of like the pink that's flowing into this leaf. And if I like something, sometimes what I like to do is add a little bit more of it somewhere else, so I have some rhythm going on, a little bit of harmony, repetition. So I'm echoing what's happening on one part of the painting in another area. And that green, again, still just wanted to keep flowing, and I've kept an eye on it. So I haven't walked away at this stage where I'm almost done and ready to let things dry. So I can lift again, suck up that color, control how much it moves onto the painting. Once this area is dry, I'm going to go in and darken up that petal to conceal kind of that yellowish area where the greens flowed in. Right now it's a good time to let things dry. With Wet n Wet, there's so much possibility. Looking at these leaves, I could plan to add in additional colors. One thing I like to do sometimes is add a little droplet of water to a Wet n Wet area that's almost dry, and that water will push against the color that's starting to dry and create a bloom. It's basically an imbalance of water in that area. So you've got this almost dry leaf with this new droplet of water pushing against the color. It creates this textural line area that can be very pretty. And just, yeah, create a little more interest in an area that might be otherwise flat. Once this has dried completely, then I get to go in and add my details. Remember, Wet n Wet is for the beginning of your painting. It's for establishing major shapes or establishing a foundation for your painting. Once that's done, you get to let it dry completely, don't fuss too long with it, and then go in and start refining your shape and adding detail and taking it to that next level toward completion. And we'll talk about the techniques we use for that in the next lesson. By liking this video and subscribing to my YouTube channel, you're helping me to grow my channel, which makes it easier for me to create great videos for you, to give you content that you're going to use in your watercolor journey. If this video was helpful to you, or if you have questions or comments or things you'd like to see, feel free to leave those in the comments below.